Good evening to all the beautiful people tuning in. I'm here to help you sleep. Please support me by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I'm also curious to know where you're watching from and at what time, so drop a comment below. Are you ready? Let's start with the first story.
The title of the story:
The Hitchhiker from the Afterlife. It was already well past midnight when David found himself driving alone down a desolate stretch of highway in the rural Midwest. The headlights of his car cut through the darkness, illuminating the endless stretch of road ahead. To his left, fields sprawled out into nothingness, and to his right, thick woods loomed ominously. The isolation of the area gnawed at him, and despite the open road, an overwhelming sense of claustrophobia settled in. He hadn't passed another vehicle in over an hour. The tires of his car hummed against the pavement, a monotonous sound that only heightened the stillness of the night. It was as if the world itself had fallen into a deep, unsettling silence. The road seemed to go on forever, as though he was driving into some otherworldly void. The thought of turning back never even crossed his mind. His fatigue weighed heavily on him, the long hours of travel pushing him toward exhaustion. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the tiredness from his mind. Then he saw it, a flicker of light in the distance. It was barely visible at first, a pale glow in the far-off dark. He squinted, wondering if it was a mirage or a trick of the road, but it grew clearer with every passing second. There, standing by the side of the highway, was a figure, a woman. David's heart skipped a beat. Who could be out here at this hour, in the middle of nowhere? He slowed the car as he approached. The woman was young, no older than 20, dressed in a tattered white dress. Her hair was unkempt, tangled in the wind, and her pale face seemed to glow faintly in the car's headlights. She stood motionless, staring directly at the oncoming vehicle, her eyes wide and hollow. David hesitated. There was something strange about her, a palpable sense of wrongness that made his skin crawl. But he couldn't bring himself to leave her stranded in such an isolated place, so he unlocked the passenger door. She climbed in without a word, her movements unnaturally fluid, like a ghost drifting into the seat. As the door clicked shut, a sudden chill swept through the car. David couldn't explain it, but the temperature inside dropped by several degrees. The warmth of his breath turned to mist in the air. He shivered, but tried to shake it off. "Where are you headed?" he asked, trying to break the tension. The girl remained silent for a moment, staring straight ahead at the road. Her lips trembled as she finally spoke in a soft, barely audible voice. "Home. I just need to go home." David glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, noting how pale she looked. Her skin was so white it seemed almost translucent, and her eyes were dark, almost hollow. "Home?" he repeated, trying to make sense of her words. "It's a long way from here." She nodded. "I know, but I have to go back. I have to return to my grave." David's grip on the steering wheel tightened. The words didn't make sense. Who would speak like that, let alone ask a stranger to help them return to their grave? "Look," he said, forcing his voice to sound casual, "I don't know what you're going through, but I died in a car accident," she interrupted softly, her voice almost too quiet to hear. David's breath caught in his throat. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The words hung in the air between them, thick with a sense of dread. "What?" he stammered, his mind racing. "What do you mean you died? How long ago was this?" The girl turned her face toward him slowly, and her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. There was no mistaking the sorrow in her expression, but there was something else, something that felt off. "A long time ago, years, but I haven't been able to rest. I can't find peace until I return." David swallowed hard, his heart pounding. There was no logical explanation for what she was saying. He glanced at the speedometer. The needle was creeping higher than it should have been, but he was sure he hadn't pressed the gas pedal harder. He tried to slow down, but the car didn't respond. It continued to accelerate. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice shaking now. "You need to get out of here. This is crazy." The girl didn't reply. Instead, she stared out the window, her gaze distant. For a moment, everything seemed normal again, but that nagging sense of unease returned. A faint, eerie whisper filled the car, soft and unintelligible, like voices echoing from the dark. David's hand trembled on the steering wheel as he pressed harder on the brake. The car didn't slow. The whispers grew louder, and now he heard it, a voice, deep and hollow, as if it was coming from the very road beneath them. "Turn back before it's too late." David's eyes darted around, but there was no sign of another car or any source of the voice. The darkness pressed in around them, suffocating and thick. The car was no longer on the road. The asphalt had faded away, replaced by a pale mist that clung to the car. And then, as if it had always been inevitable, David realized the truth. The girl wasn't a hitchhiker at all. She was a vengeful spirit, one who had been doomed to wander the earth, seeking something she could never find. And now, in some twisted twist of fate, he had become her passenger, bound to her restless journey. The car continued to speed through the fog, its engine roaring as the road twisted into an abyss. David's last thought before the world went dark was a chilling realization. The car would never stop. It couldn't. He wasn't just a passenger. He was part of her journey now, bound to her in some dark, unexplainable way. And somewhere in the distance he could hear her soft, mournful voice whispering, "We're almost home."
The title of the story:
The Ghostly Passenger. It was just past midnight, and the streets of the city were eerily empty. The usual hum of nightlife had quieted, leaving only the faint echo of distant car engines and the occasional rustling of leaves in the cold wind. Simon, the late-night taxi driver, stared at the road ahead, his headlights casting long shadows against the damp cobblestones. The moon, hidden behind thick clouds, offered no help in navigating the narrow, winding streets of the old district. The neon lights of the city's more lively corners were barely visible from here. This part of town was long forgotten, a relic of the past. Simon had been driving for hours, but his shift was far from over. The clock on his dashboard blinked 12:15 when he saw the figure standing at the edge of a dimly lit street. A man, tall and dressed in dark, formal clothing, stood waiting by the curb. His posture was stiff, his body rigid, as though he had been standing there for hours. As Simon pulled up beside him, the man stepped forward and opened the door without a word. "Where to?" Simon asked, his voice betraying the exhaustion he felt. The man's face was obscured beneath the brim of his hat, but Simon could make out the sharp lines of his jaw and the paleness of his skin. The stranger's voice was cold, flat, almost mechanical, as he said, "Take me to the old district, the abandoned mansion on the hill." Simon felt a shiver crawl up his spine. The old district, few people dared to go there after dark. Rumors had circulated for years about people disappearing, vanishing without a trace. The mansion the man mentioned had been abandoned for as long as Simon could remember, its once grand facade now a crumbling relic of forgotten history. "I'll take you, but you should know, it's not safe there," Simon said, trying to make conversation. The man didn't respond. He just sat silently in the back seat, his body unnervingly still. Simon tried to shake off the unease creeping into his bones as he started the engine, but the oppressive silence in the cab was deafening. His only company was the sound of the engine rumbling and the occasional squeak of the suspension as the car bounced over the uneven roads. As Simon turned on to the winding street leading up the hill, the atmosphere in the cab seemed to grow heavier. He glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the reflection of the passenger, but there was nothing. The back seat remained empty, as though the man wasn't even there. Simon's heart skipped a beat. He glanced over his shoulder, but the man hadn't moved, his face still hidden beneath the brim of his hat. "Hey," Simon said, trying to break the strange tension that filled the air. "You're sure you want to go to that place? It's been abandoned for decades." The man's voice came as a whisper, distant and hollow. "It's where I need to go." Simon swallowed hard, his hands tightening on the wheel. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He tried to focus on the road, but his mind kept returning to the figure in the back seat. There was something wrong with him, something he couldn't put into words. He turned the heater dial, hoping for some comfort, but when his fingers brushed against the seat, he froze. It was cold, unnaturally cold. Not just cold, but like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. His breath came in shaky bursts as the air in the car grew heavier. He could see his own breath fogging up the window, but the stranger's side of the car remained perfectly clear, as though the air around him was different, frozen even. Simon's eyes flickered between the road and the rearview mirror, searching for any sign of life in the man's reflection. Nothing. He could see the outlines of his own face, the pale glow of the streetlights playing over his features. But the back seat remained empty. No reflection, no movement, just an empty void. A chill spread through Simon's body, and he could feel his hands shaking. He wanted to ask the man more questions, but the words stuck in his throat. The silence between them was suffocating, broken only by the soft hum of the tires on the road. Finally, Simon gathered enough courage to speak again. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The man didn't respond right away. Simon stole another glance at him, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw the faintest movement, the man's lips twitching ever so slightly. Then the whisper came, as though it were coming from somewhere far away. "You already know my name." Simon's heart skipped a beat. The voice, familiar somehow, seemed to echo in his mind, as though the words had been whispered to him before. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog that was clouding his thoughts. "I don't," Simon said, his voice trembling now. The man leaned forward, his face still obscured by the hat. "Simon, I know you better than you know yourself." A shiver ran down Simon's spine, and his hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles white. The man's words sent a wave of unease crashing through him, something deep and primal stirring within. He turned his head sharply to look at the stranger, but the moment he did, the man's voice came again, closer, like a breath at his ear. "Remember, Simon, you were always meant to be here." Simon couldn't breathe. His head spun as the car crept up the hill, past dilapidated buildings and overgrown streets. The mansion loomed ahead, its dark silhouette emerging from the shadows. The windows were all black, the building seeming to stare down at him like an empty eye socket. The car slowed to a halt at the foot of the hill, right in front of the mansion's crumbling gates. Simon's hands were shaking, his chest tight with fear. The man didn't speak, but there was something in the air, something unspoken that hung between them like a dark cloud. The man finally moved, his long fingers reaching up to remove the brim of his hat. As he did, Simon gasped. The man's face was pale, almost skeletal, his eyes hollow and dark, like two pits of despair. His skin seemed translucent, the faintest trace of veins visible beneath the surface. Simon felt the breath catch in his throat, his eyes wide with horror. The man was not alive. "You," Simon whispered, his voice barely audible. The man's lips parted in a ghostly smile. "I am the one who waits, Simon, the one who watches." Suddenly the world seemed to tilt, and Simon's vision blurred. The car doors slammed shut with a deafening thud, and the world outside the cab seemed to vanish. The mansion, the street, everything was gone. All that was left was darkness. In the silence, the man's voice echoed one final time, chilling Simon to his core. "You are the one who brought me here. Welcome home." And just as quickly as it had begun, the world returned to normal. The road, the city, the headlights of Simon's taxi. But Simon was no longer alone. The back seat was empty, except for the cold.
The title of the story:
The Devil in the Backseat. The night air was thick and oppressive as Tom drove down the winding highway, the wheels of his car humming on the asphalt. He squinted through the windshield, trying to stay awake after a long evening at the party. The light from the moon barely pierced the canopy of trees lining the road, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and shift with every turn. The clock on the dashboard flashed 2:15 a.m., and Tom yawned, rubbing his eyes as he leaned into the steering wheel. His head was heavy, his body tired from the alcohol and the long conversations with friends that stretched late into the night. He had no real reason to be driving at this hour, but he was too proud to call for a ride. Besides, the road was quiet, and the isolation felt oddly comforting, like the world had retreated, leaving only him and the hum of his car. As he rounded a sharp bend, he saw him, a man standing by the side of the road, drenched from the rain that had begun to fall heavily just moments earlier. The man was tall, dressed in a tattered coat, his face obscured by the shadows of his hood. Without thinking, Tom slowed the car and rolled down the window. "You need a ride?" he asked, his voice thick with the remnants of alcohol. The stranger nodded slowly, almost reluctantly, as if he were weighing Tom's offer against something far more dangerous. Tom frowned, but the stranger's presence seemed to fill the empty air, and he couldn't bear the thought of leaving him out in the rain. The man climbed into the back seat without a word, the car's springs groaning under his weight as he settled in. Tom glanced in the rear-view mirror, catching a glimpse of the stranger's face, or rather the absence of it. The shadows seemed to cling to the man like a shroud, obscuring any features. There was no clear outline of his face, just a dark, shifting blur. Tom's pulse quickened. Was it the alcohol? Was he hallucinating? Tom tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. The road stretched on endlessly, the headlights slicing through the darkness, but the further he drove, the more oppressive the atmosphere became.
The air inside the car grew colder, the windows fogging up, and Tom shivered despite the warmth of the heater. Suddenly there was a faint creak, the sound of something shifting behind him. He tried to ignore it, blaming his paranoia, but then he felt it, a pressure, a weight pressing down on his chest. His heart pounded as he stole another glance at the rearview mirror. The man was closer, too close, his presence like a shadow looming behind him. Tom's mouth went dry. His hands felt clammy against the steering wheel. He forced his gaze back to the road, trying to focus, but the pressure was becoming unbearable. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something ancient and powerful, but it wasn't the stranger. Another creak echoed through the car. This time it was louder, more deliberate. Tom dared to look again. The man was no longer just sitting quietly behind him. His face, or what was left of it, was inches from Tom's ear, a grotesque grin stretching across his features. The eyes, those hollow, inky eyes, were fixed on him, unblinking. Tom gasped, his foot slamming on the accelerator as he sped down the road, the engine roaring in protest. He couldn't see the road anymore. It was all blurred, his vision hazy with panic. The darkness seemed to swallow him whole, and every time he looked in the mirror, the man was there, closer, until he felt the suffocating pressure in his chest. He swerved, narrowly missing a tree, and the car careened off the road, the tires crunching over gravel as he tried to regain control.
His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart thundering in his ears. The road was now a blur of shadow, the headlights casting eerie shapes along the trees. Tom slammed the brakes, the car jerking to a halt. He looked in the rearview mirror one last time, but it wasn't the stranger anymore. It was something else, something far darker. The backseat was empty, but the darkness within it seemed to move, undulating like smoke. And there, in the depths of the blackness, a pair of glowing eyes stared back at him, their malice radiating through the rearview glass. The creature's grin widened, its jagged teeth gleaming in the dark. Its hands, long and clawed, reached forward, tapping lightly on the back of Tom's seat. Tom froze, his body paralyzed with terror. The car engine sputtered and died, leaving nothing but the cold breath of the night and the distant sounds of whispering winds. Suddenly, the realization hit him. The man had never been a man at all. He hadn't picked up a hitchhiker. He had invited something far worse inside. The creature wasn't driving the car. He was.
The title of the story.
The Phantom Ride. Anna's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as the headlights carved out their lonely path through the thick woods of northern Maine. The road stretched endlessly ahead of them, winding and narrow, flanked by towering trees whose gnarled branches reached like claws into the night sky. Mark sat beside her, his eyes scanning the darkness, restless, but not wanting to break the silence. Their road trip had started as a way to escape the grind of everyday life, a chance to disconnect and explore. But now, as the hours slipped by, something felt off, as though the very air around them was heavy with secrets. The night was still, save for the occasional creak of the old car as it navigated the twisted turns. Anna had always loved this kind of isolation, the vast emptiness that came with driving through such a remote part of the country. But tonight, something was gnawing at her, a sense of unease that grew stronger with each passing mile. "Do you think we'll make it to the cabin before midnight?" she asked, breaking the silence. Mark glanced over at her, his lips pulling into a faint, reassuring smile. "Yeah, we should. I told you this was the best route. No traffic, no distractions. Just a straight shot." She nodded, but the tightness in her chest didn't loosen. She glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind them, but the road was empty. The only movement came from the wind, swaying the trees like shadows in the darkness. That's when she saw her, a figure, hunched and small, standing by the side of the road. "Mark, stop the car," Anna said, her voice suddenly sharp. She hadn't meant to speak with such urgency, but the woman's appearance had caught her off guard. Mark slammed on the brakes, the tires squealing slightly against the gravel. He turned to Anna with an arched eyebrow. "What is it?" "There's someone on the road, an old woman," Anna said, her voice trembling. "We should help her." Mark squinted into the night, but all he could make out was a frail figure standing motionless by the trees. He didn't see any immediate danger, so he nodded reluctantly. "All right, let's see what's going on." They both stepped out of the car, the chill of the night air biting at their skin. The woman stood still, her back to them, her head slightly tilted as if listening to the whispering wind. She wore a long coat, faded and weathered, and her white hair was pulled back into a knot at the top of her head. Her hands were clasped together, resting just beneath her chin. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you okay?" Mark called out, his voice loud in the stillness. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she slowly turned to face them. Her eyes were pale, clouded over with age, yet there was a sharpness in her gaze that sent a shiver down Anna's spine. "Do you need a ride?" Anna asked, her tone softer now, more compassionate. The old woman nodded slowly, her lips parting slightly, as if to speak. But no words came. Her silence was thick, unsettling. Anna glanced at Mark, who seemed uncertain, but relented with a shrug. "All right, hop in. It's a long way to anywhere around here." The woman didn't say anything as she climbed into the back seat, the creaking of the car door echoing in the still night air. As she settled in, the weight of her presence filled the car, pressing down on Anna like a physical force. "Thank you," the woman finally spoke, her voice rasping, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "I'm just trying to get home." Anna's skin crickled at the words, but she said nothing as she put the car in gear. The tires crunched over the gravel as they started moving again, the headlights illuminating the endless road ahead. The silence that followed felt oppressive. The woman didn't move or speak again, only gazed out the window, her face unreadable. After a few minutes, Anna glanced over her shoulder to try and engage the woman. "Where do you live? We're heading up toward the cabin if you're familiar with the area." The old woman didn't respond, her eyes fixed on something distant outside the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Anna turned back to the road, a strange unease settling in her stomach. Minutes passed, then hours. The road twisted like a serpent through the trees, and Anna's sense of time began to warp. Something was wrong, though she couldn't place it. They had passed the same dilapidated barn 3 times, the same rusty, abandoned gas station at least twice. Wasn't that strange? Shouldn't they have been much farther by now? "Mark," she whispered, her voice tight, "I don't think we're on the right path. We've passed these places before." He frowned, looking out the window in confusion. "No, we haven't. We're just tired. It's the dark playing tricks on you." But Anna didn't feel tired. She felt disoriented, as though the road itself had shifted. And the old woman, her silence only deepening, made her skin crawl. The air inside the car felt colder now, despite the heat being on full blast. A low crackle filled the space between them, the static of the car's radio coming to life on its own. At first it was just noise, hissing and crackling. But then there were voices, faint and incomprehensible, whispers that seemed to echo from the very walls of the car. "Do you hear that?" Anna asked, her voice rising with panic. Mark didn't answer at first. His eyes were wide now, his hands clenched around the wheel. "What the hell is that?" The whispers grew louder, louder still, until Anna could make out words, broken, fractured sentences. "You can't leave. It's too late." She gasped and turned to the back seat. The old woman's face was no longer visible. Instead, the window was covered in frost, a thin mist creeping along the edges of the glass. The car jolted, and Anna slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest. The engine sputtered to a halt, and the whispering ceased. "I need to know what's going on," Anna demanded, turning to face the woman. The old woman finally spoke, her voice barely more than a breath. "I'm just trying to get home." Anna's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea why, but she felt a compulsion to open the door. The moment she did, the cold hit her like a wave. The woman stepped out without another word, her figure swallowed up by the night. Mark leaned forward, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. "Anna, look!" The headlights illuminated a clearing, and in the center of it was an old, rusted car. A wreck. The twisted metal and shattered glass glistened in the light. Anna's breath caught in her throat. That's the site of the accident," she whispered. "I remember this. I remember seeing it when I was a child." Mark's face went pale as he looked at the scene before them. It can't be. They turned back to where the old woman had been, but she was gone. Only the echo of her final words lingered in the air. The road ahead stretched on, endless and empty, and the truth, something unspoken, unacknowledged, settled in the pit of their stomachs. They had not just given a ride to a stranger. They had given the final ride to someone who had died years ago. The cold wind blew through the open door, and the whispers returned, distant but clear. Home. Anna and Mark sat in stunned silence, the realization chilling them to the bone. They had unknowingly shared the road with a ghost, a phantom, on a ride she could never finish.
The title of the story:
The Highway Demon. The forest swallowed the road as Eric's car barreled through the thick woods of northern Ontario. It was a moonless night, and the only source of light came from the headlights of his beat-up sedan, casting fleeting shadows on the darkened trees that seemed to bend toward him like dark specters. The tires hummed steadily on the asphalt, the sound of the engine's rumble, the only noise breaking the silence of the isolated road. Eric had been driving for hours, well past midnight, heading toward a small cabin where he planned to spend the night. His work as a remote contractor often required long drives, but tonight something felt different. The woods here were dense, almost suffocating. The air hung heavy with mist, and every now and then the trees seemed to shift, giving the illusion of movement. Just as he was about to settle into the monotony of the drive, a figure appeared on the side of the road. His heart jolted in his chest, and he slammed his foot on the brake, coming to a skidding halt. A woman stood there, beautiful, but unsettling. Her clothes were torn, damp from the mist that rolled through the air. Her hair, dark and wild, framed her face in chaotic waves. But it was her eyes that caught him, large, hollow, with an almost unnatural gleam that seemed to pierce through him. She was standing right beside the road, almost as though she had materialized from the very shadows themselves. "Can you help me?" Her voice was soft, yet it carried with an authority that made Eric feel inexplicably compelled to listen. "I need a ride," she continued, her eyes never leaving his. "I live just beyond the forest. Can you take me there?" Eric's mind raced. He had an odd, uneasy feeling, a flutter of dread in the pit of his stomach. But the woman's fragile appearance, the way she swayed slightly as if she might collapse at any moment, made it impossible for him to refuse. She looked lost, and when he glanced at her again, he realized how isolated they truly were. It was a road that barely anyone ever drove down. What if she had been walking for miles, stranded in the wilderness? "Sure," he said, before he could stop himself. The woman nodded, a soft, barely perceptible smile curving her lips. She climbed into the passenger seat without another word, her presence so quiet it seemed unnatural.
Eric kept his eyes on the road, but his senses felt heightened, as though the very air around him was charged with something dark. They drove in silence. The forest on either side of them grew thicker, more oppressive. The trees closed in as though they were encroaching upon the car, their branches clawing at the windows. The road itself twisted and turned in ways Eric didn't remember, every corner blending into the next, the path growing narrower with each passing mile. The woman gave him no directions, only occasional glances, her eyes flashing in the dim light. She seemed almost too still, like a specter watching the road ahead, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the leather seat. After what felt like an eternity, she suddenly broke the silence. "Turn left here." The road she pointed to barely seemed like a road at all, more a narrow path that had long been abandoned, choked with weeds and brambles. Eric hesitated. He had driven this way before and didn't remember a turn like this. But something about the woman's calm assurance made him comply. He steered the car onto the narrow path, the tires crunching over the overgrown gravel. As they drove deeper, the house appeared at the end of the path, nestled between gnarled trees. It was large, but it looked wrong, decayed, as if it had been abandoned for decades. The windows were dark and cracked, the door slightly ajar, creaking in the wind that whispered through the trees. Eric's heart began to beat faster. An unsettling sense of foreboding filled his chest. He pulled the car to a stop, the engine humming to a halt. The woman unbuckled her seatbelt, and as she opened the door, she glanced at him, her lips curling into a strange, knowing smile. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice somehow cold, despite the warmth of her words. Eric turned to look at her, ready to ask if she needed anything else, but before he could say a word, she was gone. No footsteps, no trace, just empty air where she had been sitting moments before. The door of the car was still open, the cool night air rushing inside. He blinked, stunned. For a moment his mind raced, searching for a logical explanation. Maybe she had walked into the house. But something felt wrong, deeply wrong. With a sense of dread tightening in his gut, Eric stepped out of the car, the sound of the door creaking behind him. He stood in front of the decaying house, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The silence of the woods pressed in on him, heavy and suffocating. A cold wind stirred the branches overhead, making the trees groan in protest. "Hello?" he called out hesitantly. But the only response was the eerie creaking of the house's door swinging in the wind. He took a step forward, compelled by something he couldn't name. He reached for the door, which creaked open with a touch, revealing the darkened interior. Shadows danced across the walls, moving like living things. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the floor beneath his feet groaned with every step he took. Suddenly, a voice, soft like a whisper, drifted from the darkness. "You shouldn't have picked me up." Eric froze, his blood running cold. He spun around, but no one was there. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang, and the house seemed to close in around him. the walls pressing tighter, the shadows deeper. Panic gripped his chest, and he raced for the door, fumbling with the handle. The whispers grew louder, circling him like a swarm of angry bees. He shoved the door open, bolted to the car, and sped off, his heart pounding. Back home, the terror didn't end. Strange occurrences plagued him, whispers at the edge of his hearing, shadows that moved when no one was around, the feeling of being watched. He couldn't shake the image of her, those cold, knowing eyes. Days later, he stumbled across a local legend, a story that chilled him to the bone. The house he had visited was known in town as the site of an ancient curse. The woman, a creature of legend, had roamed the highway for centuries, luring lost travelers to her doom. She was the highway demon, known to trap souls who dared to give her a ride. Eric's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. She hadn't just vanished, she had marked him. And now he was part of her world, forever bound to the cursed road, forever trapped in the demon's grasp. And as he looked out the window that night, he could have sworn he saw her, standing at the edge of the forest, watching him from the shadows. The road she traveled was no longer just a path. It was his. The highway demon had claimed another soul.
The title of the story.
The Last Ride. Mark had been on the road for hours, his eyes half-lidded as the dull hum of his truck's engine served as a lullaby in the night. The road stretched endlessly before him, flanked by dark, dense trees that seemed to close in like a suffocating grip. He glanced at the clock, 2:45 a.m. He should have been off the road by now, but the long haul from Montreal to Quebec City had been exhausting, and he wasn't about to stop at a run-down diner in the middle of nowhere. His headlights pierced through the thick fog that had rolled in, thickening the air with its damp, heavy presence. That's when he saw him. A figure on the side of the road, barely visible except for the faint silhouette of a man hunched by the guardrail. Mark slowed the truck, instinctively wary. It was late, and most people wouldn't be out here at this hour unless something was wrong. As he approached, the man raised a hand, signaling for him to stop. Mark hesitated, but then rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" The man looked up with wide, nervous eyes, his face drawn, the skin taut across his gaunt features. "Please," the man said, his voice low and shaky, "just to the next town. It's too cold out here, and I don't want to be walking in this fog." Mark nodded, eyeing the stranger's worn coat and boots. "Hop in." The man did so without a word, his movements jerky, as though every action was an effort. He settled into the passenger seat with an uncomfortable sigh, casting a wary glance out the window. For a moment, Mark didn't say anything, just focused on the road ahead. But the silence between them wasn't peaceful. The man kept shifting in his seat, his hands gripping the armrest as if to steady himself. "Long way from home?" Mark asked, trying to break the tension. The stranger's eyes darted toward him briefly before he turned his gaze back to the road. "I guess you could say that," he replied, his voice quivering ever so slightly. Mark continued driving, wondering if it was the cold or the fog that made the stranger so jittery. They passed the first bridge, a dilapidated structure of rusted steel and weathered wood, and the man suddenly tensed. "Stop," he said sharply, his voice rising. "Stop the truck." Mark's foot hovered over the brake, confused. "What? What's wrong?" The man's eyes were wide, and his breath came in short, shallow gasps. He stared out the window as if he expected something to happen. "We can't cross it. Not yet. Not now." Mark didn't argue, but pulled over to the side of the road. The man was shaking now, his hands pressed tightly against his chest. Mark watched in growing concern. "Hey, you all right?" The stranger didn't answer, his attention fixed on the bridge, his mouth moving as though he was whispering something to himself. Mark could just make out the words, but they sounded fragmented, as if he were lost in some distant memory. "Okay, that's enough," Mark said after a long moment, unsure of what to make of the man's behavior. "We're past it. You want to get going?" The man slowly nodded, but his eyes never left the bridge. As Mark put the truck in gear and drove away, he caught the faintest whispering, like whispers in the wind, but there was no one else in the truck. They passed another bridge, and the same thing happened. The anxiety came over the man once again, his body rigid, his eyes frantic. "Stop, please, not yet." Mark had had enough. "What's your deal? Why do you keep doing that?" The stranger turned to him, his face now pale as if drained of color. He paused, his voice trembling. "I don't want to die again." Mark wasn't sure what to make of that. Die again? The man's gaze locked with his, and for the first time, Mark noticed something strange in his eyes, something cold and distant, like they were seeing right through him. "I never made it off the bridge. I didn't survive." Mark's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. "What are you talking about?" But before the stranger could answer, they reached the final bridge, the largest and most decayed of all. The man's eyes widened in horror, and he began to scream, louder now, his voice breaking through the heavy silence of the night. "Stop! Stop the truck!" Mark slammed on the brakes, skidding slightly on the wet road. The truck lurched to a halt in the middle of the bridge, and the man's breathing became ragged. "This is it," the man whispered, his voice barely audible now. "I never made it past this one. They never found me." Mark stared at him in disbelief. The fog clung to the edges of the bridge, and the whispering grew louder, echoing in the silence of the night. The sound was unnatural, distorted, like it was coming from underneath the bridge itself. The man's eyes were wide, his face twisted in anguish. "Please, don't leave me here." Mark's stomach churned. He reached for the door handle, but before he could open it, the man's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "Mark, you don't understand," the man said, his voice now desperate. "I never left. I can't leave." The truck's headlights flickered once, then went out entirely. When Mark blinked, the man was gone. The truck was empty. No passenger, no sign of the man anywhere. The faint whispers continued to echo in the air around him. He was alone now, but the bridge felt heavier, colder, as if something was watching him from the shadows. Mark didn't wait to find out. He floored the gas pedal and sped off, never looking back. But the whispers followed him, and in the rearview mirror he saw the faintest flicker of a figure standing on the bridge, watching him disappear into the fog. That night, Mark didn't stop until he reached the next town, where he heard about the crash on that very bridge, the crash where a man had died years ago, the very man who had been sitting beside him. Mark would never drive that road again, and he knew, deep down, that the man's restless spirit would always be waiting.